Hello world, hello internet, hello people who are interested in UK politics and government, and hello Jason Isaacs, I'm back. It's been a while since I did a recording on politics and government, but hopefully we'll remember how to do it. And I'm coming at you live from my new studio / office. I hope the sound's going to be okay. And I hope the video is going to be okay. This is really, as it says on the tin there, this is an introduction for those of you who are just starting on UK government and politics, trying to give you an idea as to some of the most important concepts that we have to deal with as we start our journey. If you like it, fantastic. Please do let me know, and like and subscribe, tell your friends. That's the way these things tend to work. If you don't, well, I can roll with constructive criticism, so you're welcome to sling that in my direction as well. Okay, so UK politics and government. This is intended primarily for people who are studying the EdXL course, but if you're doing the AQA, then it probably won't come in. It will probably come in relatively handy, and I hope that well, maybe you'll have some interesting questions for me at the end of it. But let's crack on, shall we? I think it's about time we got on with this. Now, this is a really cheesy start, but I just want to make this point because it's really important as we go forward. There we have the UK. Where is politics there? Well, the short answer is there are no politics there, because that's just land. That's mountains and probably a few sheep. There's no politics there, because where's politics? Well, politics comes from the people. And that's really, really important when you're talking about a democracy, because in a democracy, the ultimate source of political power is the people. We've got to ask ourselves, where does all of this political authority come from? Well, once upon a time it would come from the monarch, but then we had something called the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And what we saw there was the transfer of power from an absolute monarch to a constitutional monarch, which is basically, yes, you can be the king or the queen, but you're going to have to follow the rules that we want you to follow. So political authority doesn't come from the Queen, doesn't come from God either. We're not a theocracy. Nope, we are not. And it doesn't come from the sun or the volcano, because we're just not that sort of people. In fact, no, it comes from us. It is the people that are the source of all authority in the UK. We answer to nobody. And you could say, yeah, okay, well, technically we're subjects. But again, we've got that thing called the constitutional monarchy, which means that the Queen, the monarch, is answerable to the people. It's one of those strange fudges that we have. And you'll come across lots of these as we go through British politics. But here we are. We are a democracy. The source of all political authority is the people, and that means that we get to call ourselves a democracy. And this is a definition that I suggest you learn. Democracy, system of government predicated, that means based on popular sovereignty. That's a really, really good way to remember what a democracy is. And we'll develop that definition a little bit further down the line, but that's good enough to be getting on with at the minute. So we've established our democracy. We've established that all political authority flows from the people, but then the question becomes, well, what are we going to do with it? And what we're going to do with it is we're going to create an entity that I think is going to really, really help you understand the course ahead. And that is this idea of the civil state. Now, we can talk about this in all sorts of ways. We can contrast it with somewhere where they haven't got a civil state. We're now at the beginning of September in the beginning of September 2021. We've just seen the withdrawal from Afghanistan by the Western occupying troops. That has created a system. There is no civil state. There isn't. There's a theocracy that's just taken over. If you don't like what the Taliban are doing, your options are fairly limited, because there they do not have a civil state. There you have the Taliban claiming direct authority from above and shaping the state in a way that they perceive to be right. Here we have a very, very different system. We have a system of laws, man-made laws, a country planted thick with laws, as was so eloquently put in A Man for All Seasons. So we've got laws everywhere. And what we have are authorities whose job it is to make sure those rules, first of all, are broadly acceptable, that they're followed by everybody, and that they are upheld in a way that is fair, consistent, and reasonable. So that is what we call the civil state, and it's all around us. It's rather like trying to explain to a goldfish what water is. It's hard to do. It's just everywhere around us, and it's that constant and consistent set of rights and rules and laws that we all have. So the question is, having established that we are a democracy and having established that we live in this civil state, we need to think about how we create that civil state. How is it that we make that civil state? And the critical idea there is law. Again, this country is planted thick with laws, So how do we get those laws? Well, we've got our people, all right? We now need to move from there to an entity that's capable of making law. Now, 666 million people, we can't make law as an organization. That's just going to create chaos. So we need to get some sort of political organization going on here. And here we have political organization. This is the political map of the UK. And you can see just there, these are the results of the 2019 general election. So what we've done is we've taken the country and we've divided that down into 650 different constituencies. Now, each of these is a little self-contained political entity. Talk about this on this slide. So we've got 650 constituencies, one MP, one member of parliament per constituency. They go to sit in the House of Commons and they represent the 100,000 people in that constituency and the 70,000 voters that each constituency has. So this is the basic unit of political organisation in the UK. We call it the constituency, 100,000 people, one MP per constituency, from which it follows with elegant inevitability that there are 650 MPs in the House of Commons. And every year, or every 5 years, or whenever the government decides to call an election, we get to hold those MPs to account. So here's the 2019 map, here's the 2017 map. You can see maybe a few differences there, but it's quite hard to drill into. I'm going to drill into that in a bit more detail using different kind of different charts, different models, just to try to make it a little bit more evident for you. So this is where we are at the minute. You can see there we've got 363 Conservative MPs. That's an important number, but it's not as important as this bit here. So this is where we get what we call a majority. The Conservatives have got more than 50% of the vote. In political terms, in terms of the House of Commons, we therefore say that they have got a majority in the House of Commons, and that means they get to form a government, but we'll talk about that in a little while. It's going to be easier actually if we go back and we look at some historical results, okay? So this is where we are now, and you can see there that there's a very, very comfortable gap between the Conservatives and the rest of the House. It's a gap of about 88 odd seats. So these guys could all gang up together, but if the Conservative Party was nicely organised and disciplined, and in the main it is, then if it came down to a vote, it's very, very unlikely that the Conservative Party is going to lose because they've got this nice big gap here. You know, basically half of these would have to decamp over here, and that ain't going to happen for all sorts of reasons that we're going to talk about at a later stage. So that's the situation in 2019. This is the situation in 2017. Now you can see here straight away, this is very, very different. Now, the Conservatives have got the most, so you might choose to call that a majority, but that's going to be quite confusing in the context of the game we're playing here. So what we're going to call this is a plurality. That is to say they've got more than any other single entity, but what they haven't got this majority. And so what that meant was that if all of these guys ganged up and they all had a vote, then the Conservatives might lose. So what the Conservatives did was they struck a deal with these guys up here. This was the DUP, and they struck a deal with them and they said, okay, if we give you X, Y, and Z, will you support us in certain key votes? And the DUP said, yeah, okay. But it was never very easy. It was never good. And that's why it only lasted 2 years. Most parliaments will last an awful lot longer than that. But anyway, this was 2 years. So here we have a plurality of votes, which leads to what we call a minority government. That is, they don't have a majority. They have a plurality, but not a majority. But if everybody else ganged up on them, then we'd say, yes, they'd probably lose a vote. So that's why we call it a minority government. Over here, back in 2019, nice, big, comfortable 88-seat majority. Boris is sitting very, very happily. Thank you very much indeed. We cut across now to 2015, and in 2015, yes, we have a majority government, but look how tight that was. basically about 12 seats in it by the end. But it was a majority. The government was able to remain in power fairly comfortably until we had the Brexit referendum, and then we all went, well, you all know what happened then. So, just coming back to this again and looking at it from the top, here we've got a majority. Here we've got a minority government. That's what we call it. Again, they have a plurality of seats, but they don't have an absolute majority. Here again, we have a majority, wafer thin, but it's still a majority. And then finally, back over here, we're in 2010. You've probably heard about this one. This is the coalition. So here you can see, once again, the Conservatives have a plurality, but they don't have a majority. In this context, these guys here, this was the Lib Dems, they could have chosen to go across there, but they didn't. So they struck a deal with the Conservatives, and they remained in power for a relatively successful, certainly fairly stable, 15 years. So this is what we call the coalition, and you might have heard of that on your travels elsewhere. This was a formal arrangement between these guys, the Lib Dems, and the Conservatives. Now remain over here, this was not a formal coalition. This is what we call a confidence in supply motion, but I'm getting ahead of myself and that's just going to get confusing. What I want you to get from this is the way in which the parties will line up in the House of Commons and the very, very important consequence that comes from that. And that's to do with how we get to a government. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what I want to do now is I just want to go back and have another look at what this means for Parliament, which means in particular for the House of Commons. Now, what this means is that the House of Commons have got legal authority, okay? They are the highest legal power in the land. It's not the police, and it's not the courts, and it's certainly not the government. What we're talking about here is who has the right to create law in the country, and it's Parliament. And just while we're here, just remember that Parliament is two parts. It's the House of Commons, which we've been talking about so far, and also the House of Lords. Now, the House of Commons and the House of Lords are different entities. They both belong in Parliament, which is why we say that Parliament is bicameral. It's composed of two chambers, bicameral. And they're not alike in dignity. One is more important than the other, specifically the House of Commons, because the House of Commons has been voted for. The House of Lords is appointed, and so it is a secondary house. But nevertheless, when the House of Commons and the House of Lords get together, they create Parliament, and Parliament has legal sovereignty. Now, legal sovereignty in the context of the game that we're playing is that only Parliament can make law. Once that's made, only Parliament can change or abolish that law, and no Parliament can make a law that a future Parliament cannot change. Now, right now, that probably sounds really quite abstract, but trust me, it gets very, very, very important later. So this is the legal sovereignty of Parliament. Parliament gets to make the law. Again, I know we've got a Supreme Court, but all the courts can do is apply the law that Parliament has created. And the courts, the Parliament, the police, similarly, they still have to apply the law that Parliament's created. Government can't create law. It can ask Parliament to make law for it, but Parliament has to be the one making the law. The government cannot make law. And that's a really, really important point that even ministers of the Crown sometimes seem to struggle with. So here we go. We're coming back to the House of Commons. We've had an election. The Conservatives have got a majority. They've got more than 50% of the seats in the House of Commons. The House of Commons by itself can make law, but what law is it going to make? Well, it needs somebody to tell it what laws it's going to make, how it's going to make them, how long it's going to spend making them, all of that sort of stuff. And that is where government comes in. So government's job is to tell Parliament what to do, and then once Parliament has created those laws, it then is responsible for implementing those laws across the wider country. That ability to make decisions is what we would call an executive function, and that's why another word for the government is the executive. Their job is to make decisions. And specifically, what sort of decisions are they making? They're making policy decisions. Policy is, what are we going to do? And so the government in this case can be said to have policy sovereignty. What is Parliament supposed to do? They are going to take the government's policy and turn that into legislation, thereby building the civil state. So if you like, the architects of the civil state is the government. The builders of the civil state is Parliament, and then we all get to live in it like happy little campers. So government policy is, what are we going to do? And the people who make those decisions, we call them the government, and you can see there a slightly more detailed explanation of what that is. And one question they always like to ask in papers is, to what extent have elements of the state where you can read? I'm not going to answer that now, but brace yourselves, that one's coming later. Good. I hope that all made sense. I'm going to go through it again just to try to make sure that everybody's happy. So we are the political sovereigns. Through elections, we choose our legal sovereigns, that's Parliament. Their job is to create laws. They are the builders of the civil state. And then we have on top of that, the policy sovereigns, that is government. They decide what they're going to do. So in terms of the civil state then, civil state, these are the architects, and these are the builders, and we all get to live in the civil state that between the two of them they create. That particular thing there is something called parliamentary government. I'm going to touch on that in the next slide, but it's much more important at this point that you understand what we're talking about here with the civil state. The government decides what the civil state is going to look like. Parliament creates that civil state through legislation, and then we all live in it. So, once again, here's the country. Where's the politics? It's not there. We need people. We also need laws to create that civil state in which we live. That's Parliament's job. Parliament's job is to create the law. But which laws are they going to pass? Who's going to design the civil state? Stupid boy. Who's going to design the civil state? Well, that's government. Government gets to decide which laws, and then Parliament makes those laws. So our relationship with Parliament is described by this word, or this idea here, representative democracy. They represent our interests. Parliament and the government are linked by this thing called parliamentary government. That means this. It's really fairly straightforward, I think. We grant authority to the Parliament, that's representative democracy, and then Parliament grants some of that authority onto the government, tell us what to do. But then on the flip side of that, we've got this idea of accountability. The government is accountable to Parliament. That's the other side of parliamentary government. It cuts both ways. Government tells Parliament what to do, but if the Parliament is not happy with what the government is telling it to do, it can hold it accountable, and it does that through a number of different ways. And of course, similarly, we hold our representatives to account through the mechanism of elections. So every 5 years, we get to decide how we think these guys are doing, and if they're doing an appalling job, then we vote for somebody else, or we don't. So this is the important relationship. Again, political sovereignty, legal sovereignty, policy sovereignty, and this all feeds into this idea of the civil state that we're going to look into in much more detail. Government designs the civil state, Parliament builds the civil state, and then we all get to live in the civil state. And that is it, really. Yes, it is. So I'm going to leave that one there. If you've got any questions, you know where I am. Do please drop me a line. Tell me what you'd like me to look into. I hope that helps. If I can make things clearer, then please do come and see me. Otherwise, thank you very much. I'll see you in the next recording. Take care now. Bye.